Thank you very much for the opportunity to present. So thank you very much to Kevin, Julieta, and Doug for selecting the paper. It's really a pleasure to present in front of such an interesting crowd. So in the interest of time, let me dive right into it. So this paper is about, well, following up onto what Marcus was presenting, where should these jobs or these opportunities come from that their paper was about analyzing who would go for them. So this paper is about, can big push infrastructure unlock development? And it's about Ethiopia. So maybe a bit obvious for the audience here is the observation that economic development is strongly positively associated with structural transformation out of agriculture. And that means for the remainder of the talk, I will very loosely kind of use these two terms in almost an interchangeable manner. You're probably aware of like the most recent evidence that this kind of positive association both holds as a cross-section, but also over time. Now, there's a very long literature trying to kind of understand better how single infrastructure expansions could cause structural transformation and economic development. For example, Dave Donaldson's paper on railroads in India, or Ben Faber's paper on roads, or further papers on roads by Banerjee, Duflo, and Xian, or Kevin's work on bridges, dams. Any kind of infrastructure has probably been tried to analyze with respect to its contribution to economic development and structural transformation. In reality, though, that's not usually how infrastructure is being rolled out. These infrastructure expansions usually come either bundled or very tightly sequenced. And history is like really full of examples where infrastructure did arrive in such bundles. For example, the New Deal, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the Soviet Commission for the Electrification of the Soviet Union, the GOLRO, and many, many others. So just to highlight a couple. So in the New Deal, they were mostly kind of bundling roads that later became the interstate highway system with rural electrification, but also with bridges, tunnels, etc. For the Tennessee Valley Authority, they were bundling hydropower dams with the rural electrification, some roads, and even public libraries. In the Soviet Union, what they did was they tried to build industrial parks, then power plants next to it, and a road network to have these industrial parks be connected to markets. And I guess everybody's aware of the most recent Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, where they're building ports, electric supergrids, and a lot of roads in Sub-Saharan Africa and other low-income countries. However, how such different forms of infrastructure investments can interact is not really well understood, which brings me to this paper, which is about the question, how does such big push infrastructure, how does this interaction matter for structural transformation and economic development? What I do in this paper is fourfold. First, I collect new geo-identified data on one particular example of a very big push infrastructure expansion over the last 2 or 2.5 decades, and that is from Ethiopia. And what they did in Ethiopia was mostly invest in two kinds of infrastructure, roads on the one hand, and a dramatic increase in electrification on the other. And I'm tracking this over time and space. Now, with that data at hand, I will then try to convince you that I can estimate reduced form causal effects of these big push infrastructure investments, and the outcome variable of interest for me will be structural transformation or changes in sectoral employment patterns caused by these investments. What I then do is to take the inherent GE nature of these investments into account is I develop a spatial general equilibrium model of two kinds of infrastructure and how they may interact. And I can show you how isolated investments compared to the big push or the combination of the two can come up with diverging sectoral employment patterns. Now, with that model then at hand, I use the reduced form and the model in combination to structurally estimate the productivity implications and the welfare implications. And that then allows me to kind of disentangle almost like a welfare ranking here of the big push against more isolated rollouts of infrastructure. Now, to make this a bit more intuitive, let me give you a very, very simple example where I'm just drawing two districts. One could be a bit larger, the other is a bit smaller, and this district on the left here may have like a pre-existing road network. And now what we're thinking about is what could happen if we are connecting these two districts with a road, and let's think about the economy in three sectors. Now, what the classic economic geography literature would predict is that, well, if this is the more central or bigger or larger kind of market, then there should be specialization, so that the remoter district, once connected, would specialize in agriculture, would lose some of its more traditional manufacturing base, and if services is non-tradable, would see increase in services. On the other hand, you see the reverse picture apart from the services in the bigger place. Now, that's something that, as I said, Krugman and Venables have kind of described in like the 90s already, but it's also resonating with Ben Faber's paper on China, where he can actually find that the remote districts that do get connected to the center do actually lose some of their manufacturing employment. Now, what if these colors also mean something here? What if there's something else going on top of this road connection issue? What if, for example, the center, as is mostly common or the case in developing countries, the center has been historically electrified, so in Ethiopia would be Addis Ababa, for example, but the remote area is actually not. So would it make any difference if we then also kind of electrify that remote district on top of that? Well, what I'll argue in this paper and what I'll find empirically is, yes, it does, because this productivity shock for the more modern sectors of the economy may lead to a reversal of the manufacturing employment share in this smaller remote district, and that may be important for our overall understanding of how infrastructure and interactions of infrastructure can lead to structural transformation. Now, there's a couple of complications here, and I'll go through, there's three complications, and I'll go through all of them briefly, because if this is so simple, why do we just not get the data on electrification, get the data on the road expansion, and then run some OLS? Well, there's some obvious concerns. Number one is that the infrastructure allocation would most certainly be endogenous, or in other words, no policymaker could get away with not targeting these super expensive pieces of infrastructure. For example, in this example, if I zoom out a bit, maybe this district was the first one to get a road, this one was the second, etc. And maybe the policymakers were focusing size here or expected benefits. So it's certainly endogenous, who got a road when. But also on the electricity side, these two may have been electrified. These two are yet awaiting electrification, may never get it. So what was driving the policymaker to choose these two lighter ones over these two darker ones? Well, that's clearly an endogenous problem. What I do to tackle that is that I develop an instrumental variable for each kind of infrastructure, one for the road expansion and one for the electricity. And then I'll try to convince you shortly that will then get me a causal effect, a causal reduced form effect of the effect of infrastructure on structural transformation. Okay, fine. Well, there's another complication on top of that, which is obviously that there will be general equilibrium repercussions. If we're thinking about this road connection here, even if we think about randomizing that kind of road, just tracking the outcomes for this place here does not seem to kind of be a kosher exercise unless we also take into account that, for example, if this place is now growing due to the gains from trade, there'll be a demand shock on all the other places that are potentially kind of trading with that place, which could be these grayed out areas here. So that, in other words, and that's something that, for example, David Lagakis was also mentioning in his pathfinding paper on Friday, that the control group here may be not a pure control, and we need to take that into account. What I do in this paper is I develop a general equilibrium framework where both roads and electricity is allowed to have GE effects. The roads by affecting trade costs, and electricity by affecting modern sector productivities. And what I then also do is, if you then take this local average treatment effect from the previous step, what I can do is actually I can inform the structural model with these local average treatment effect or net effects. And if I have the model exactly replicate these effects, I can learn a lot about, firstly, what happened in all these other places, and second, what are the overall welfare effects. Now, lastly, I face a problem that is not unique to this context, which is, if you're thinking about this as a matrix of, well, you could have a road but no electricity, or a road and electricity, or neither. If you think about this as like this kind of treatment matrix, then I'm missing this cell, which is you got electrified without having access to a good road, at least at the district level, which is my unit of observation here. A district in Ethiopia is 40 by 40 kilometers, so it is quite large. Why is that? Well, that's mostly due to common sense construction constraints. If you do want to build out these high voltage and medium voltage transmission infrastructure, there needs to be some way to bring in a truck to construct it there. So it is not unique to my setting that you're kind of missing this. Well, that could then mean that I'm kind of open to criticism that could be, well, if you do find that the road causes one thing and the road plus electricity causes another, then that's just due to the electricity, isn't it? So what I do in this paper is then I tell you, well, or I'm trying to show you, look, if I do have a baseline calibrated model and I force the model to replicate the local average treatment effects from the reduced form, then I can actually estimate, I gain 1 degree of freedom. So what I can actually estimate is this missing elasticity of how productivity will kind of be affected by electrification. And that then actually allows me to back out from the model what this cell here must have been. And that will then allow me to give you a more proper kind of counterfactual welfare comparison. Now, in the interest of time, so as I said, 3 complications and 3 parts of the paper which address that. I'll go quite quickly through them, so my apologies for that. Are there any pressing clarification questions? Okay, so why Ethiopia? Well, so I feel Ethiopia, for the purpose of this paper, is an ideal setting for infrastructure study. There were large-scale investments in 2 and only 2 kinds of infrastructure. Just to show you some maps, this is the expansion of the road network over a 20-year period, so it almost quadrupled. So this is on the left, 2000, on the right is 2016. This is only focusing on asphalt, bitumen, or gravel, so anything that can carry a truck. And in the same time, the electricity network almost doubled in extent too. So this is the electricity network from the early 90s to basically today. So this is actually this is a prime example of a big push in infrastructure. And luckily for me, there's an almost complete lack of any direct infrastructure substitutes. So Ethiopia is a landlocked country. They don't have any major navigable rivers or canals. The single railroad line to Djibouti is out of order for most of my sample period. And there's no more than a handful of really, really old diesel generators to substitute for the grid. So in other words, the arrival of the grid is the first time you have access to modern power. And I'm also quite lucky in terms of the outcome data. I have occupational choice data where people report in what kind of sector of the economy they're working from 2 distinct sources here, which is the DHS 4 rounds from 2000 to 2016 and 3 rounds of the National Labor Force Survey. I could also, for example, use the LSMS, but as previous presenters have done, unfortunately, in the Ethiopian context, the LSMS has such little spatial variation that that's not really helpful for this broad spatial variation that I need. Okay, just very, very briefly going through the identification here. As I mentioned before, I need 2 instruments, so I come up with 2 instruments, one for electricity, the other for roads. I don't have time to go through all of them, but let me just highlight the most intuitive one, which is the electricity one, where I'm exploiting the fact that in Ethiopia, all of the, vast majority of electricity comes from hydropower dams. So there are 9 major dam openings, and on a graph, this looks like the following. These dams are these red dots, like kind of out in the middle of nowhere, so really out in the sticks. And at some point, this dam comes online, and from then onwards, there will be a high voltage line connection to Addis Ababa, the center, which was where most of the load or the demand for electricity was focused. So the engineers really tried to just connect the new supply to where most of the load was. And accidentally, they electrified a lot of these kind of districts on the way, which will be where the variation is coming from in this paper. So let me go back. I then also developed a IV for the roads. And if you're worried about the exclusion restriction, I can show you that these districts that did accidentally get a road or did accidentally get a road or electricity, that they are not different on observables in terms of any observable I can find. What I'll then do in terms of the regression specification is, as I said, I'm interested in the local average treatment effect. I'm basically running 2 SLS on top of what is a quasi difference in difference with 2 endogenous regressors. Just to kind of refresh your minds, this is the same picture as before, just with the numbers here. So as I said, this cell is basically empty. So I have 2 treatments. Either you get a road, or you get both, or you get neither. Okay, first stage is a strong, robust throughout. So let me just briefly walk you through the core result of the reduced form. What I do find is that roads in itself do cause a marked increase in services, and that goes at the expense of manufacturing. Whereas the big push, or the combination of roads and electrification, will lead to a reversal in this manufacturing employment at the expense of agriculture. So let's just have a look at the table. First line is just the road. The second is the interaction. And these are all 2-stage least squares results. And as you can see, there's this big increase in services at the expense of manufacturing. And then the big push will actually lead to an almost identical reversal of that. Why is this effect, this agriculture, kind of insignificant? Well, I'll come back to that in a second, but this is due to very strong spatial heterogeneity, that some places really strongly increase agricultural employment with road access, and others do actually decrease it. So on average, it's an insignificant 0 here. In the spirit of the presentations from theme 0 last week, like, okay, what about occupations here? What about industries? Does it matter how we define the sectors? No, it does not matter. The results are pretty robust, that it's always about agriculture against services against manufacturing. But the one thing I do realize, or that you can see from the results, is that the kind of manufacturing applications that get kind of lost with the road are more traditional. Whereas in the big push locations, the new manufacturing employment is mostly from more what I would deem modern occupations. And that is also nicely kind of resonating with further kind of evidence on more people in employed jobs working in big push locations, centering of the age pyramid around prime age workers in these locations. So a lot of the youth go to school. There's only in-migration to places that have at least both kinds of infrastructure, etc. I can also show you that this is not just driven by, well, the road and the electrification will cause a lot of construction, so it's just a construction effect. No, it's not that. And then I can also show you that tentatively, all of this matters for welfare. That if I use Alvin Young or Angus Deaton style welfare proxies from the microdata, I can show you that only the big push locations really significantly grow or are better off. And then finally, as I alluded to before, there is some very strong spatial heterogeneity, especially with respect to the nearest market town, that especially the places really close to the market town, they're really hit by road access in terms of their manufacturing employment, and they are also the ones who benefit the most then from electrification later. So this is all screaming for like a spatial GE model. So let me just very, very briefly introduce you to the setup here. So there's just 4 features to the model. This is a multi-region Ricardian trade setup as in Eaton and Corton, where locations differ in their productivity, in their geography and trade links. And then, as I mentioned before, roads are allowed to have GE implications, and so that all gives rise to a spatial general equilibrium, as in Ellen Arkalakis or Redding or many earlier papers. What I then also add here is that electrification is allowed to have GE effects via affecting modern sector productivity. I'll just model it as a plain and simple TFP shock in these sectors. But if you want a more sophisticated example, you can look at David Lagakos and Stephanie Fried's paper where it's about the change between the change from a traditional to a modern power-driven technology. And then obviously, as I mentioned before, the outcome of interest here is structural transformation, and that is then a multi-sector economy spatial structural transformation, as in Michael's Rauch and Redding or Eckert and Peters spatial structural change. Okay, very briefly, the object of interest here is, at least in partial equilibrium, would be how much does sectoral employment in, for example, manufacturing, how much does that change in location K when location N, which could be the same but could be a neighboring one, does get this treatment, which is either a new road or electricity or both. Now, as I mentioned before, I assume that in my model, roads are mostly affecting trade costs. And the second shock that I'm modeling is that I do assume electrification to affect services and manufacturing productivity more than agricultural productivity in this Ricardian comparative advantage sense. I can then show you that in this my kind of model, under very, very reasonable kind of parameter settings, I can actually replicate the reduced form results, where I can show you that these the two shocks can lead to diverging structural transformation patterns. Now, in the remaining 5 minutes, what I want to focus on is actually just the structural estimation now. And this is actually kind of, I need this picture kind of to explain a bit better. In the longer form of this presentation, you would have seen this picture many times already, but in the short version, not. So this is about basically how do I connect the infrastructure investments, which are roads and electricity, to the outcomes of interest, which are changes in sectoral employment patterns and changes in what I call like real wage or any welfare proxy. So this is spatial GE model, so I'm using real wages here. Well, they're connected via two kind of model variables. The roads will be affected by the trade cost between locations N and I and how that changes with a new road. And the electricity is mostly affecting this TFP shock for the manufacturing and services sector in that location. Now, how I go about this problem, so I know already I've shown you reduced form evidence how the infrastructure is relating to kind of these outcomes. So what I now need to work on is, or in other words, the full causal chain here is, I need to kind of connect all of these different elements with each other to figure out what the the welfare estimates from a structural estimation would be. So what I do is, I proceed in 5 steps, and maybe I'll have time to kind of go into 1 or 2 of them. Firstly, I need some translation of how distance, which is obviously going to be reduced due to new and better roads, how distance will translate into trade cost. So I need to kind of come up with like a way of translating distance to trade cost, and I do that in an almost standard way by alluding to spatial arbitrage and a lot of kind of micro price data. Then I calibrate the model on baseline observables, on sectoral employment, all from micro data, and this just obtained trade cost metrics, and I obtain baseline productivities. Now, with all of that at hand, I can actually start this process of somehow kind of trying to focus on this link here, which is, as I mentioned before, not observed in the reduced form, which is how does electricity actually affect productivities, or the elasticity of productivity with respect to electrification. The elasticity of, yeah, okay. So what I do is actually I set up this kind of this moment function here where I say, look, I know from the reduced form what this with these changes to sectoral employment are according to the local average treatment effect. Let me just try to bring the model as close as possible to that under one additional assumption, namely that the elasticity of productivity A with respect to electrification is log linear. Now, when I do that, I'll kind of find one novel kind of estimate of that, but I don't have time for that, unfortunately. So let me just go to the welfare results, because the moment I do have this elasticity, I can do the following. I can show you a true counterfactual analysis where I can show you what is the baseline kind of real wage kind of effect, and how do different kinds of infrastructure investments vary from that. I can show you either just what would have happened had they just built out roads. I can show you what would have happened had they just built out this counterfactual electricity. And then finally, how does that differ from the real wage multiples of the big push? And the one thing that I want you to take away from this picture is that there seems to be almost an order of magnitude difference between the isolated investments compared to the big push, which is what this paper is about. Now let me conclude because I ran out of time. So what I try to show you is causal evidence of a big push infrastructure interaction effect for mostly manufacturing employment. Road access alone lead to an increase in services at the expense of more traditional manufacturing, whereas this adverse effect gets reversed when you add electricity on top of that. And what I tried to highlight from the structural estimation is that all of this big push seems to be material to welfare. Thank you very much.
So I think this is a very interesting paper from which I learned a lot of things. This actually made me think about the state of this particular field and this particular topic. So one of the reasons why I like this paper a lot is because I remember being present in my work on India about the aggregate effects of the removal of policy distortions or infrastructure projects. And I remember being super worried about getting the following question, which is, okay, you're analyzing the effect of building roads in India, but everyone knows that there were many other policies going on at the same time. So how do you think this interacts with the construction of roads? How this interaction may affect your inference about the effects of building roads? And conceptually, how do we think that these policies may be related in a structural model? So I think in that sense, this paper is taking a step forward. Understanding the interaction of different policies that we know that in poor countries, they always come together. Some of super big kind of general question about the paper, which is something that actually Margaret also pointed out, which is the way we usually think about infrastructure is actually we want to analyze the indirect effect of building infrastructure. We think of infrastructure as transportation costs going down, and then we want to think about this increases the amount of trade in the economy, increases the room for comparative advantage, or in the case of Niclas' paper, we think about electrification as increasing TFP, and we think about the effects of this increase in TFP. But kind of one might think that what we call like the big push may be like a direct big push. And what do I mean by a direct big push? What I mean by that is that this increase in infrastructure may represent, and in fact, it seems like it's actually clearly the case that it's a big demand shock. So governments are spending a lot of money in a particular year. Some of this policy or some of these infrastructure projects represent a big chunk of GDP. And this clearly represents a demand shock that is very asymmetric across sectors. For example, one might think that increasing the quality of roads is going to be super biased towards the construction sector, which itself depends a lot on manufacturing through input-output. And this is going to have a lot of effects. So kind of a general question is, why don't we think about the big push in a direct way? So do we think there's going to be a mechanical effect of this increase in demand or not? And then we can think about this demand shock interact with the fall in transportation costs and electrification and so on and so forth. Kind of a second point I wanted to make was about how do we think about electrification? So clearly this is something like, has been recently developed in the literature, like taking electrification seriously in our models. In this particular paper, we just think about it as a TFP shock that affect the modern sector versus the non-modern sector differently. But we might think that even within the modern sector, different sectors rely on electricity very differently. And this actually comes back to some of the discussion we had last week in Theme 0, which is about how sectors are connected with each other. So perhaps one might think that electricity is a factor that is very important for manufacturing, is crucial. So you need like electricity to produce, at least in the modern manufacturing sector, whereas in services perhaps less important. So kind of my comment is like, what would be the next step to think about electricity more seriously in terms of what is the production function of these sectors and how electricity gets into that production function. So there is these new papers by David Lagakos and Steffi Fry that actually think about this production function and as electricity being like super high complement of capital, for example, we might think that not only electricity affects sectors differently, but also factors within a sector differently. And these things might be super important. Another point is about income effects. So I understand that in the infrastructure literature, this is not as common as in the structural change literature, but in the structural change literature is, has been, like always the case that people think about income effects, how when households become richer, how they actually become more biased towards the consumption of services versus manufacturing? In other words, how do we think that different sectors may have different income elasticities? And in the particular case of your setting, this seems to be, a kind of an important candidate when thinking about why sectors become bigger or smaller, because all these shocks are going to make some regions richer than others, and through income effects, they may affect different sectors differently. So this is something that could be extended into your framework, but it seems like income effects could potentially matter. My last comment is about how the inference of these changes in productivity have been done in your paper. So somehow you're taking a very interesting approach, which is I'm going to just assume that productivity enters in the production function of services and manufacturing. And then the way I'm going to infer these changes in productivity through electrification is because I'm going to make the model to match all the sectoral reallocation that I observe in the data. So it's a very indirect way of identifying this productivity. So my question is, to what extent the prices that are implicitly being changing in your model, so all these prices that are changing through this increase in TFP, whether we can make sense of those. So these prices that your model generates, do they make sense? Can we just correlate them with the changes in prices in the data to see whether these changes in productivity that you infer, whether they're sensible or not? And the main reason why I'm asking this is because in the structural transformation literature, the way we usually identify changes in relative productivities is precisely to look at changes in relative prices. So in that sense, you might use some of the insights from this literature to identify your productivities, or at least to check whether the changes in productivity that your model delivers may actually be consistent with the changes in prices that you observe in the data. So I'm done. I think Margaret had many questions in the chat, so perhaps she wants to start the discussion.
Hi, Nicholas. Sorry, it's just the same old question. I just not sure how we marry your results with this fact that the employment share in modern manufacturing in Ethiopia is actually falling. And yeah, that's my big question. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Should I just reply now? Yeah. Okay.
How does it work, Kevin?
Yeah, sure. So let me just briefly reply to Margaret, and then also maybe to Manuel's comments. So the one thing that I'm abstracting away here is that population growth. So population growth is dramatic in Ethiopia over this time period too. And unfortunately, the highest fertility rates are always in the rural, agrarian, or subsistence kind of areas, which is on the macro kind of scale, always leading to this counterintuitive finding that the agricultural employment share seems to be very stubbornly high, even though if you take any of my results at face value, there must be dramatic movements out of agriculture at the micro level. So I think looking at fertility could be one of the solutions to your question. The other is maybe about different definitions of manufacturing. Maybe if we come back to Margaret's own classification from last Thursday about cottage industries, very small scale and large scale. I'm not kind of covering the large scale here at all. It's mostly about these kind of movements out of cottage into small scale. That's at least what I think I'm picking up. But I need more data to kind of double check. I do have the data, but I just haven't done the check. Then to Manuel's very great comments. I think the direct
Niclas, can I just ask you a question Michael Peters is asking, because he cannot speak, and this is very related to one of my questions. So Michael is asking, well, he's saying I cannot speak right now to ask my question directly, but could you elaborate a little bit about the underlying source of the complementarity that you highlight? Are there demand complementarities as highlighted in the original Big Push? Are income effects and local demand important, or is it mostly productivity gains in combination with trade frictions? So
it's the latter, yeah. So I haven't kind of, so if you look at the model, the version of the model that's in the paper, you'll see that this is like a standard Eden quantum. So there is no complementarity here. There's no smoking gun. What I do find though is this empirically relevant kind of welfare effect. That is coming from exactly the interaction of dramatically lower trade costs with a productivity shock. That's all that is happening. Or in other words, if you only electrify these places, why is the electrification welfare effect so low? Well, that is because you're electrifying places that basically don't have any market access. So they will have some higher productivity, some local GDP growth, but they're kind of missing out on serving this larger market. And likewise, if you do just build roads in places that do not have electricity, then these places seem to be mostly specializing in agriculture, and there will be gains from trade, but these are a lot lower, or at least in my results, they seem to be a lot lower than what you could be getting from this structural transformation out of agriculture. That's a great question. Should I maybe continue, or more questions first?
Well, there is another question by Costas. He said, may I add to Michael's comment?
I can say it. No, it's kind of, in these models, there's a one-to-one change in welfare from a change in productivity. Like you can analytically solve cases where you hit the productivity 1%, then the welfare gets 1% to a first order. So like here you get like productivity increasing and trade cost decreasing, and you get like almost an order of magnitude from the double than the single. Right. I mean, like it's a strong result. So I would like invite you to try to cook up an analytical example where this holds because of the computer.
Yeah.
Maybe like 3 locations or something like that.
Right. So I think this is I mean, especially from the trade theorist side, that's a comment that I've heard before, because it's absolutely right that analytically there's no complementarity to be seen here. So this is a purely empirical result, which is coming from the fact that the product, like to calibrate the model on the baseline observables, the productivity differences between these remote places that are all in agriculture and baseline, and the towns where you have a more mixed kind of economy, that these productivity differences must be so large that then kind of opening up the economy to these kind of remote places and changing productivities there, that has a lot larger effect when combined with the trade cost reduction than without. That's my cheap answer to that, as in like it's a purely empirical result. It would be great in future work to actually kind of have a theoretical contribution here too, where you say, oh, let's go back to the old big push literature, Murphy, Schleifer, and Vishny, and try to kind of adopt that kind of that complementarity directly into the model. The other alternative would be to use a Krugman style kind of IRS version,